However, the intimated analytical undertaking of the performance of these founding fathers is unjustified in the face of overdrawn mistakes ascribed to the transition of their respective states from colonial rule into self-governance. Indeed, caution must be urged when appraising the gains of independence in relation to the pioneer work towards the construction of the foundations of our individual states, nationhood, alongside attendant social development precepts, lest we downgrade the epic value of pioneer contribution within the context of the time and circumstances that prevailed back in the day. In this regard, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the government of Uganda for extending to me the invitation to attend and celebrate with our brothers and sisters only yesterday the 49th edition of independence of this phenomenal East African nation. While the occasion to mark Uganda's Independence Day, held in Lira yesterday, was joyous, the practice of holding this annual celebration rotational in different parts of Uganda each year is an exemplary expression of inventiveness with respect to establishing and consolidating the gains of nationhood. Allow me to return to this subject only shortly. At the very outset, independence was valued as an end to authoritarian colonial rule and a transition to a new era of freedom and respect for human rights. Independence effectively, therefore, heralded an era of respect of the rule of law, entrenchment of honesty, and the hitherto elusive regard for integrity in the conduct of public affairs. In essence, freedom meant that an individual was enabled to realize the benefits of citizenship and beget a deep sense of belonging to one's nation. To what extent this bore envisaged fruits, a further critics obviously needs to be undertaken. With regard to bedecking the citizenry with a sense of dignity, and commendably so, independence constitutions of East African countries provided well-meant values, even though the Bill of Rights as such was not necessarily enshrined in all of the constitutions in East Africa. Consequently, East African countries demonstrated tremendous improvement in indices critical to the entrenchment of human rights and indeed the rule of law. Indeed, it is soon after this that Africans began to rise to senior positions in public service, to invest in large-scale entrepreneurship, and also be able to own businesses. Africans also got access to equal and fair treatment, to own property, including land, to realize justice before our courts of law, as well as to enjoy administrative justice. And by administrative justice, I mean fair play in the delivery of services, fuller participation in government of their countries, and the right to hold those governments to account through competitive elections and popular representation. That also meant participation in decision-making, also through electoral representation, as well as the right to constitute civil society groups such as trade unions and other group associations. Meanwhile, the East African region has since recorded impressive gains in entrenching peace and political stability by and large. In this regard, save for isolated cases, East African nations have largely enjoyed relative tranquility and stability. It would be insincere, however, to fail in pointing out the particular stretches in the history of Uganda, in Rwanda, Burundi, and Kenya have been visited by horrendous eruptions of the breakdown of order that must not be allowed to reemerge any time in the future. On a more hopeful note, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya now have rewritten their constitutions in an effort to realize a fresh start. Besides, among East African countries, competitive elections are held regularly, the most recent having taken place in February 2011 here in Uganda. And I must actually own up here that I was able to join President Museveni in his campaign in Western Uganda. And I must tell you that it was wonderful to wake up at the footholds of the Rwenzori Mountains. Coming from the low-lying lands of eastern Kenya, semi-arid regions of Ukambani, it was a big treat. Of course, in November, we had also elections in Tanzania 2010, and also in Burundi, and in Rwanda in 2010, and of course our own elections in 2007 in Kenya. And I'm sure you do know the outcome of those elections. They led to Africa's first grand coalition government. No wonder I'm actually in my presentation talking about the citizens' grand question. In retrospect, it is remarkable that East African countries actually began the independence phase with lofty ideas, with institutions and practices about government in relation to the expectations of our citizens. Unfortunately, East African governments at some point dropped their guard and let go of the ideals that define the aspirations and expectations of independence. They failed the consistency test that led to the outright reversal of the gains of independence, including the ideals of integrity and dishonesty. In some cases, reversals of the spirit, intent, and letter of independence occurred under the very same leaders who had overseen the transition of their countries from colonial domination to independence. However, the same also occurred in more dramatic and devastating ways, specifically through coups d'etats or through the overthrow of existing constitutional order. Highlights of the reversals of the gains made at the outset of independence include a shift from competitive multi-party elections to a restrictive single-party system of government. At this stage, democracy suffered loss in terms of representation, participation, accountability, the rule of law, exercise of individual rights and freedoms, and above all, the establishment of justice. Yet, the leaders of the time argued passionately in favor of the revised system of political values and practices, mostly in defense of the sanctity and the integrity of the state, national security and peace, as well as harmony. Those involved argued that such political surveillance would create favorable conditions for political stability and social development. That notwithstanding, the lapses in integrity and honesty, call it in terms of good governance, that followed were too embarrassing to acknowledge, and therefore no resolute attempts were made or could be made to explain them. These were also days of scientific socialism. The movement across Africa, I remember as a young student in the sister University of Nairobi, Mr. Chancellor, but I do recall that it was fashionable then in Africa to even welcome military coups d'etats. And little did we know that that actually was going to prove to be the undoing of Africa. Suffice it to say, the reversal and democratic gains of that critical transition to independence is one of the fundamental mistakes of that period. Where specific leaders are often blamed for this mistake, it is our turn to reappraise the circumstances of the time and be able to see whether to place responsibility on the national leaderships, in which case we accord primacy of explanation to individual agencies, or to lay blame upon systematic structures that invariably predisposed individual national leaderships to the political disorientation and dislocation that they suffered. Regardless of whether we choose to blame individual actors or systemic weaknesses, the most important point is to acknowledge that mistakes that should now serve as an important lesson and reference point as we move on into the future were actually made. In fact, I can confidently venture to suggest that every era in the history of human society can be associated with certain fundamental human flaws, oversights, and miscalculations, including the histories of presently acclaimed democratic and economically developed societies of Western Europe and North America. Therefore, we have to accept that a lot of things have changed. We have to accept that those mistakes that were made were mistakes that were perhaps at the time and trying to hold brief for the leadership at the time, that was seen to be progressive. That the times of the Cold, the divide between the East and the West, you all remember the divide between Moscow and Washington, the days of James Bond and the famous movie-making issues that all of us consume, because you see a 007 as an agent. And you kind of always thought this man never lost in any of his missions. What the world expected, ladies and gentlemen, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the significance of the collapse of that war, when the then president in Moscow, Mr. Gorbachev, was told by President Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, bring down this war. The world had hoped that after the collapse of this East-West Cold War, we were going to reap the peace dividend. But what has instead happened is astonishing.